PJ, can you turn this one off? Second row, I think. There you go. It's a little better. Are you guys about ready? Do I need to do the microphone feedback thing again? Is there anybody, as you look around, that you know is coming is not here yet? I wouldn't wait for him anyway. All right. Welcome. Last day. Finals day. We'll call it finals day. So Brian mentioned to me that I need to clarify what the project is, the, I guess, at-home project for those who are taking it for credit. Is that true? Do you guys need clarity? Well, what did he say? So I don't... And that's it? That's all he said?
You do the outline, or actually, if you want to, we can type it out.
Yeah, so I think this is the only thing that I would ask, since I suppose I'll be the one reading them. Make a couple things obvious as you're writing it. So make your, which outline did you choose? Where are your points? So like if you're going to bold them or give them make them a little bit bigger, or say it's like point 1, point 2, point 3, but don't do it in such a way where all the text looks the same and I have to guess what your point is, or where one point ends and the next point begins. Just make it easy to be able to look at it and know, oh, they're going for a shotgun approach, or they're going for a sniper approach, or whatever. Okay? The other thing I would say is you don't need to write it out verbatim, word for word, what you're going to say. Of course, if you want to, that's fine. But you can do bullet points, but have a couple things written out. So things like your transitions should be written out verbatim, so I can kind of look over that and know that you got the hang of it and you know what you would say and how you would actually get from this thought to the next thought. And with your stories, you don't need to write them out verbatim, but maybe, give me the bullet points of the major parts of the story. So bullet point, I was out disc golfing with some friends. And then the next point, my buddy pulled out his favorite disc or something. And the next point, he threw it and it went into the pond. The next point, I turned around to look at him to say, win some, lose some. Next point, he's running towards the pond, taking off his clothes, jumping in the pond. So I can kind of get a general idea. That's a real story. But yeah, it was awesome. But then in your story, make the reset and reveal statement, write those out verbatim. So I kind of can look and get an idea that, I don't know, how you would use that story and how you would reset it and how you would make that story work. Does that make sense? So just certain parts that you guys talked about specifically within the class, write those out verbatim. But then the rest of it, you don't need to worry about writing a 10-page whatever sermon. You can do bullet points. And then did he talk to you guys about what to write about? Did he give any guideline to that? So I would say, if I were you, pick something that you foresee yourself talking about in the near future. Let's say there's something on your calendar for three months from now or something like that. Go ahead and just write on that. So that way you're not just doing a project. You can kind of get into it, emotionally pray about it, and you know that there'll be a pretty good return on that project. Or I would say maybe you could write it over, I think you guys talked about in one of the first classes your life theme, or the theme that you always return to. You could do it on that too. So whatever that theme is, or whatever that statement is that you wrote down, what would be your quintessential talk for that idea? And then you could think through that, because maybe at some point in your life you would give that talk on that theme. If somebody ever said, hey, I want you to teach, and you can teach on anything that you want, that would probably be the talk that you'd give anyway. So any questions on that? Does anybody need my email? Yeah. Let's make it due in a week from today. If I get it by next Friday, that's fine. Yeah.
So this talk that we're writing for the project is not necessarily the talk that we're supposed to be giving.
No. Yeah, different talk. Yeah. So take your time. You know, you can space it out over a couple days and think it through and come up with stories and illustrations, whatever. If you don't have my email, it's easy. It's just anthony@tampaunderground.com. So,
Sorry, one more thing.
yeah.
Brian was saying to do an idea, an illustration, and a story, like as the assignment.
Okay.
So like
For this? For today?
no,
Okay.
no, for like the project.
Okay.
So like do all three of those things.
No,
We're
it
not
was
doing
done
that.
today. You prepared today, yesterday and today for one of those three, but not
Okay,
for the end.
but not for the project.
Yeah, but not the main project for the credit, no.
All right, never mind. I'm done now.
Thanks.
You probably will have those things.
But if you're doing it for credit, you're going to have to share one of those three anyway. So it's not for naught. Okay. I trust you guys. Just turn in something that's good and you'll get credit. You'll be fine. So I guess you guys have spent the last 7 days kind of talking about how to get into a message or a talk, how to prepare yourself, how to write it. And then, of course, you have talked about how to give it, how to communicate your talk. So I'm not going to talk too long because we need to set aside a lot of time for you guys to do your little 3-minute idea, illustration, story exercise. But I did want to, Brian asked me to just touch on real quick the aftermath. So, you know, what happens when you are on stage and you say your final story and you give your final reset and you make your call for transformation and then perhaps you pray or do communion or whatever, and then you're getting off stage and your foot hits that step or whatever, and it hits you, like that flood of emotion kind of comes over and you're like, oh my gosh, you know, like I didn't land that joke, or I totally fumbled in my notes, like I got lost in my notes and I stalled for what seemed like 5 minutes, you know, or nobody seemed engaged at all. It seems like my talk kind of fell on dead ears. What do you do at that moment once your talk is said and done? What do you do? What do you do, I guess, when your expectations weren't met? You know, it's kind of like giving a talk is a lot like having a baby, you know, so there's a lot that goes into the anticipation. I don't know personally, but I do know by proxy. But there's, you know, 9 months, at least 9 months, like getting ready for having a baby. You're learning about what to do during delivery. You're thinking about, you know, how you're going to do it, what your method's going to be, what that's going to look like, who your OB will be, or like whatever, and you're getting prepared, and it takes a long time, and then finally that moment comes, and the baby's delivered, and then when it's done, you have this baby that perhaps you weren't prepared for, and your expectations are not going to be met, and there's a slew of emotions. You know, it's not over once you have the baby. There's years or a lifetime left of, you know, dealing with, or not dealing with, but living with. Sometimes it feels like dealing with. But living with what just happened and altering your expectations and getting ready and preparing yourself and responding in a healthy way to, you know, how that went. So we're going to talk really quick about the aftermath of a talk, of a message. And, you know, personally for me, I was kind of excited to be asked by Brian to share on this because I feel like I used to serve with a ministry called the Navigators, a lot like InterVarsity at USF. And, you know, when you're on a small staff team, you end up teaching a lot, you know, and you end up teaching on a lot of stuff that you don't know much about. So I can remember so many times, you know, being maybe on stage or something at what we'd call a Nav night, like our large group meetings. And you've spent, you know, 20, 25 hours, sometimes 30 hours if I'm that obsessed about it, getting ready and preparing and praying and wondering and thinking and strategizing and writing and then rewriting. And then you get up there and you're just like pouring your heart out and you're spilling everything that you have. And you're like trying to find the people in the audience. And I can remember this one time, I haven't done much preaching. I'm still young, I guess, in being a communicator, but I remember one of my better talks was on prayer. And I remember it was some of my best ideas and some of my best stories, and everybody laughed at the jokes and, whatever. Probably one of the best things I've ever delivered while on stage. And, I make this great call and, pray and close it out and say goodbye to everybody. And afterwards, I was absolutely convinced that everybody would go find a corner of the room and just start praying or something, or just leave in silence, at least leave in silence and just go home and pray or something. I don't care, but totally convinced that people were going to move to a monastery and devote their lives to solitude. I was like, this is the best I've got ever. This is it for me. And as soon as it was done, I prayed. I was like, amen. And people got up and they were like, man, you want to go see Transformers tomorrow? And I was like, no, Transformers. Did you hear anything I said? You're talking about Halo after I talked about building the kingdom, and it was. And I remember in that moment, it was devastating. I felt wretched. I actually told myself, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. If that's the best I've got and people are still talking about Transformers afterwards, getting up, joking around, cutting up, I don't know that I want to do this. So, typically when somebody is finished with a talk, I would say 99.9% of the time, it's usually a negative response. I've seen people finish a talk and they feel really good about it. I think that there's a healthy response to any talk that's given ever. And it's like an equilibrium. You can kind of fall on one side, which maybe looks negative, or you could fall on the other side, which looks positive, but in fact it's not positive. It's just maybe arrogance. And so I want to talk real quick tonight just about 3 quick, typical, more common than not. Of course, I'm not being reductionistic and saying these are the only 3 responses to a talk, but maybe they're more typical. You'll see these more. These would relate more than maybe some others. So here's the 3. The first thing that people tend to do is they become hypercritical. So this is to say that some of us become too hard on ourselves and we find it difficult to have an objective view of what we've just finished doing, and we dwell on all of the quote-unquote mistakes that we think we made, and we can hardly think about anything else. And so this is my kind of default mode. This is where I kind of tend to go. Is I am obsessive in everything. Everything I do it obsessively. And when I'm critical on myself, I do that obsessively. So as soon as I finish, I know exactly what joke I flopped. I know exactly how poorly I told that story. I know exactly how badly I wasn't passionate, or I got to my notes. And that's usually the biggest feedback I get is once I get to my notes, I'm flat, or really dynamic when you're out here. And then I know that when I get to my notes, I'm becoming hypercritical. Some of us too hard on ourselves, So I know that I do that, and then I think on that constantly over and over and over again. So that's usually one of the first things that we do. This is kind of the one that I tend to align myself with, is becoming hypercritical, obsessively critical about yourself. The next one is, we'll just call it failure or depression. So this is sometimes all of us, sometimes all of the intense prayer and the preparation that went into preparing can actually produce a kind of spiritual low after the intense ministry experience is over. And we can sometimes feel like we've failed God and just slipped into a miniature depression without knowing why. Let me ask, actually, the first one, for those of you who have, presented or communicated in front of, a group or whatever, who tends to err towards that first one of being hypercritical, obsessively focusing on your mistakes? A couple of you. Who can relate maybe to the failure depression one, where it's once I'm done, I dip into a depression? Yeah, I was actually asking Drew. I was like, man, who do we know that kind of dips into a depression? And he was like, man, sometimes I feel like Drew will, or Jeremy will kind of dip into you ask him afterwards, and he's like, nah, that was the worst sermon I ever gave, and just that sucked, and whatever, I don't know. I don't want to talk about it. Kind of response, and just way too hard on yourself, dragging emotions. Come on in. So that's sort of the second one, and then the last one is denial. So some of us Just completely forget about the experience, wipe it out of our memory. We consider it over and we move on to the next thing as if that talk had never happened. So of those who are in here, who could maybe relate to that one? Tend to just forget about it. Yeah, I was talking to Brian about this earlier, and he's like, that's me. You know, it's like, once I'm done with the talk, I'm done with that talk. I'm not thinking about it. I'm not reflecting on it. You know, if I offended somebody, it's gone. It's like, it's out of my mind, you know.
Do you ever find yourself like flowing through all three of these?
Oh, yeah, it's like the 5 stages of grief.
I'm gonna die. It never happened.
Yeah. And then acceptance. Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah, perhaps they're not mutually exclusive. But at some point, at some place, once you kind of finish up, you're going to probably feel some or all of these. Hopefully not all. That's a whirlwind, man. It's like, I don't know if I couldn't handle all of them, at least not at the same time. But I think I would like to suggest that the experience of a letdown is not simply, you know, a normal kind of I don't know, letdown or depression or becoming hypercritical. Sometimes it's more of like a grace, or it can be a gift, this sort of response towards, you know, getting off stage. I think that God created us to work, and then right immediately afterwards, He created us to have a rhythm of rest. And so what we experience is a kind of spiritual exhale in that moment. So, you know, over and over again, you can kind of see Jesus throughout the narrative of His ministry, throughout the you know, timeline of the Gospels. There's this pattern or a rhythm of Jesus doing ministry and healing or preaching or teaching or whatever, and then kind of slipping into a moment of solitude or contemplation or rest. It's the inhale and the exhale. It's the inhale of ministry and then perhaps the exhale of contemplation and rest and reflection. It's actually a chance for us to stop, rest, and perhaps even remember who God was in the midst of that. Have you guys heard of Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 Hours of Mastery? Have you guys ever heard of that? Essentially, Malcolm has this idea, this concept that in order to become a master in something, that once you've done something for 10,000 hours, you're a master in that thing. And so, of course, applied to this class, once you've prepared for 10,000 hours, you are a master at preparing a talk. And once you've presented or communicated or done a message for 10,000 hours, you are then a master communicator, or taught. Once you've done 10,000 hours worth of seminars, at that point you're a master seminar giver, right? I was thinking about that, and I was like, I think that definitely applies to communication, to the getting up of the on stage and learning how to present your material and prepare your material. I don't think that it applies, though, to the aftermath, what we're talking about today. I think that there's a difference between a grace and a skill. I think the communication and the posture and the presentation, that would take about 10,000 hours, but I think the grace comes in afterwards. So this portion, maybe this small mini lecture or whatever, would maybe be one of the only things in this class that wouldn't take the 10,000 hours to become a master in, because it's a grace. Could you imagine that in order for the grace of rest and exhale, the Sabbath moment after the talk or the presentation, could you imagine only getting to experience that after you've also completed the other 10,000 hours? There's a difference between a grace and a skill. Skill takes 10,000 hours, but the grace is something that we can apply almost immediately afterwards. So whereas everything else I think we've talked about, or you guys have sort of journeyed through in this class, this is different. You could do this if you presented tomorrow and perhaps you blew it. You could still experience the grace of this rest and Sabbath and release this spiritual exhale immediately. It's a grace. This is different. And when we are employed by the Spirit of God, it's both exhilarating and it's exhausting at the same time. At that point, God is calling us into a Sabbath rest with Him, a chance not just to cease from the work, but to reflect, evaluate, and most of all, to be thankful. I think that that's something that's interesting for me. You know, quick example, I did a wedding on Saturday, and I had spent a lot of time writing it and typically when I do a wedding, I'll tell the story of the couple, and I'll spend maybe like 5 or 10 minutes on that, and then I'll reset it into the gospel. So I'll find some element of the couple, and then I'll try to highlight something about God and talk about the gospel through that imagery or that vocabulary. But this wedding had a translator, and the translator was making what would usually take about 1 minute, take about 3 minutes. And I wasn't expecting it to take that long, and so the wedding was dragging on. And I remember thinking at one point while the translator was going, our reservation's about to expire at this garden. Like, I can't share the gospel like I wanted to. And that's what I have to cut out. Like, I can't cut out the vows. I can't cut out the promise or the pronouncement. Like, it's kind of what we're here for, like for them to get married. So as Chris was translating, I just kind of closed my eyes for a minute. I was like, God, I have to leave out your gospel. Like, I'm going to not share this. I'm really sorry. And afterwards, once it was all said and done, there was a moment where I was like, I need to rest in that mistake and trust God with it and believe that it's okay, that there's a redemptive quality to it, that all is not lost. It's not like perhaps there would have been a great revival at that wedding or something, and now there isn't because I didn't share the gospel. But instead, trust God with my mistakes, and whatever happened. Most of us need at least a few hours alone or in a secure place to thank God for all the prayers that he actually did answer. I think that's interesting is when we get off stage, we tend to focus more on the things that we think God didn't answer than focusing on the things that he absolutely answered. And for the chance to be used by God. Given a God-centered rest, most of us are actually then better equipped to reflect on the work that we have done and say which parts were good and which parts could be improved. If we wait for the perfect talk for us to believe then that God actually used us, we're going to be waiting for the rest of our lives because we'll never give the perfect talk. Even once you maybe hit those 10,000 hours, it doesn't mean that you give perfect talks. It's just you maybe get to that level of mastery. So it's important to be prepared for that. Once your talk is finished and you're done and you're stepping off the stage, there most likely will be negative emotions that arise, and you might feel hypercritical, or you might feel depressed or like a failure. You might even go in denial, but that's okay. And almost use that as an advantage. Use that to be something that pushes you back to Jesus, entering into that rhythm of ministry and rest, inhaling and exhaling. Does that make sense? Great. I just wanted to share that real quick. Communicate that to you guys. Hopefully get expectations corrected. So we're going to go ahead and spend the rest of the evening shooting Nerf guns at whiteboards. So was everybody here? Do we know how we're doing this? Does everybody understand the... Yes. So we're going to go ahead and go through the folks who signed up for the class for credit first. And I guess we went through about 5 or 6 of y'all last night, right? So I don't know who those were, so you're going to have to help me. If I call on a name and you've already went, except for Anthony. Anthony's going to go twice. So I'll go ahead and call your name, and then what will happen is you'll take this gun. Do you have to cock it back? Cock it back. And then you're going to shoot. And you're going to either hit, well, hopefully you hit in here. You're going to either get a story, an idea, or an illustration. And then you're supposed to have one of those, or all 3 of those things prepared now. And then you have 3 minutes to present your story, your idea, or your illustration. And at the end of it, what I want to do is leave some space and some time for some feedback. So, and I think I want to ask this. Let's try to balance the amount of critical feedback with more positive or affirming feedback. So it can be, it's nerve-wracking enough just to get up here, right? It's even more nerve-wracking to hear your peers say, this is what you did wrong, this is what you did wrong, this is what you did wrong. So somewhere in there, somebody, of course, take it upon themselves to say the things that they did well. Sound good? Is that what we'll do? It's free. You don't have to do it? I like you don't have to do it. Or you do all three. It's the wild card. Yeah.
If one of yours is really short and another one of yours is really short, you do the two of them. Like really.
No more questions. No. There was an uproar about your question, and everybody said no, so I'm just going to go with the democracy of the class. Sound good? All right. Adriana, did Adriana go? You ready? 3 minutes? Because we got a lot to get through, so try to keep it to 3 minutes. Where do y'all stand from yesterday when you shot? This is it? I like this. I like the range shot. Uh-oh. Catherine, there's, I don't know. Oh, the cartridge moved. Catherine.
Maybe it needs to be shut down. The front section.
Oh, that sounded good. Oh, don't look at it. Just look right in her eye. We need the rifleman here. Thank you. There we go. So illustration. Illustration.